Good morning. Welcome to Quilting with Lori. My name is Lori Dickman, and today I'm going to be sharing with you how you can use your scrap stash to make the blocks that are in my new Garden of Eden quilt. This top here on the wall is not yet quilted. I have just finished it. It's part of another Two's Company series that I have been bringing to you, where I take two scrappy blocks and I put them together to make some beautiful quilts, which often can create secondary designs. This one has a lot of lighter colors. It's more for spring, and so I'm working on some quilts over the winter that I will have done and ready to go in the spring. But it has some lighter fabrics. I'm using a lot of the Red Rooster fabrics from a few years ago. I've had these in my stash. And then, of course, a bright red and some beautiful greens. And it's just going to be a gorgeous quilt. And I can't wait to get it quilted for you as well. But now let's go to the tabletop and see how you can make the two blocks that are required for the center of this quilt. All right, for those of you who are not familiar with my channel, I do love to be able to teach you how to use your scrap stash to make blocks. And there's two of them today that I'm going to be showing you. This one right here, which I've already put together for the quilt that you see on the wall. And then the other one is the Irish chain block. And I'm going to take you to your scrap stash, and you're going to learn how to use your scrap stash to make these blocks. Although in this case, for the quilt on the wall, I did use these four fabrics. I had two lights and two darker fabrics that I used for the quilt. For those of you who are not familiar with my Speedy Solutions book set, this is my techniques book. It teaches you everything you need to know to get your scrap stash cut, sorted, organized, stored, and ready to use to make beautiful quilts. There are 5 scrappy patterns in it. And then this is my patterns book. It corresponds to this. All 12 patterns in this book were made using these scrappy techniques. So that book set, or the individual books, that's all available on my website. And I'll link below so you can take a look at that if you're interested in reading more about it. Now let's get to these quilt blocks and see how they are made. The first one that we're going to make is this one right here. And basically you need 2.5 inch darker fabrics, and I've got a width of fabric strip from my 2.5 inch strips container. You're going to need some 4-inch squares, and those will be the 4-inch squares. We're actually going to trim those down to 3 3/4 inches here in a minute, but I don't store 3 3/4 inch squares in my stash. I simply store 4 inches, and therefore all I have to do is cut 1/4 inch off 2 sides, and I've got what I need. Then we're going to pull 3-inch squares, for which we are going to snowball all of these little squares here. And then, of course, we need a 2.5 inch square for the center. I went with yellow. And you can make this as scrappy as you want. You can change out your values. Maybe you'd like these values to be light and these values here to be dark. Totally up to you. It's your block. Have fun with it. So for this block, I went to my stash and pulled my 4-inch bin, and that's for these 4-inch red squares. And you can use any colors. I just happened to pull red ones here. So that is what I needed. I also went to my stash and pulled 2.5 inch squares because I needed 2.5 inch square for the center. I also pulled 3-inch squares because each one of these red squares is going to be snowballed with 3-inch squares. So you'd need to pull a total of 12 of these light 3-inch squares, 4 of these dark 4-inch squares. We need 4 of these darker 2.5 inch wide by 5 1/4 inch wide strips. And then of course a 2.5 inch square. And so that's what I pulled. And I keep my strip stash in this container as well. So my 2.5 inch strips I've pulled, and I'll subcut. So let's see how this gets put together. So the first thing I'm going to do is with my, and this happens to be a full width of fabric strip that's 2.5 inches wide. I'm going to remove the selvage there. And I need 4 of these strips, 2.5 inches wide by 5 1/4. So I will simply subcut that. And now I have 4, there's 2 on each of them. And then if you remember, I mentioned how these 4-inch squares needed to be reduced to 3 3/4 inches. So I'm going to do that as well. And this little leftover here, this can be chopped and just put in your pet stuffing pillow if you'd like, or any kind of stuffing that you'd like to use for making stuffed animals or pillows, whatever it is that you choose to make. So what we're going to be doing then, here we've got this. I want to make sure I'm in the screen here for you. I think I am. So there are those. Here is my yellow square. And then, of course, these are going to be snowballed with these 3-inch squares. And then for the 3-inch squares, what you're going to do to prepare those are simply cut them on the diagonal one time. I think I mentioned in an earlier clip you needed 12 of these 3-inch squares. You really only need 8, actually. And then they are going to be sewn on each end here, and it will result in a square and a square, or kind of like when you're snowballing squares. So every one of these 4 blocks is going to be sewn like that. And then we have our strips here. Once this block gets sewn together, then it will end up being 12.5 inches, or at least that's what you need to square it up to, is 12.5 inches. When I sew a square and a square, or whenever I am snowballing or putting on a triangle, or sewing a triangle to a square, what I like to do is simply press a crease into the center of each of those triangles, as well as press a crease in the center mark of both or all sides of the square. And that allows you to match up. So that crease line there will match up to this crease line, and that's where you'll pin it. And your points should extend off the edge of that square just a little bit. And then when you sew your seam allowance, sew a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Remember that there is the turn of fabric that we have to deal with. When you're sewing these, sew opposite sides first, then press them open, and once they are pressed open, then sew the other 2 sides. Let me sew these two sides first, and I'll bring it back and show it to you. All right, so I have sewn these 2 sides and I've pressed them back. Now I'm going to do the very same thing to the opposite. It's just very easy. I'm sure you've all done this before. Match that up. So these 2, then I am going to press these open after they have been stitched and square it up to 5 1/4 inch. Each one of these square and a squares needs to be 5 1/4 inch before it's sewn into the block. Once you have your square and a square unit ready, it needs to be squared up to 5 1/4 inches, and then it will be sewn with your 5 1/4 inch long strip. This is 2.5 inch. And this. So this becomes 1 row. This becomes the 2nd row. And then when these get finished, this will become the 3rd row. And you'll sew those rows together to create this block. And then square it up to 12.5 inches. So that is the first block. Now let's take a look at how to make the 2nd block. All right, so for the 2nd block, which is this simple Irish chain block right down here, I've gone to my stash. I have pulled my 2.5 inch squares. I've pulled my 4.5 inch squares, and I've pulled my 2.5 inch strip container. So those are what you need for this block. So this center block is a 4.5 inch, and then these outer squares here, these are all 2.5 inch squares. Let me bring it down here farther so that you can see this. I want to make sure I'm kind of centered here. Now, there's going to be a couple of rows of some strips. And so this first round of strips in here, they're going to be 4.5 inches in length. And I simply went to my strip stash and I grabbed a lighter strip stash. And again, you can grab any colors, values, whatever you choose. You don't have to follow what I'm doing right now. You can reverse your values if you choose. But I'm going to need 4 of these 4.5-inch strips to go around in these areas here. Let me cut 2 more. Let me get rid of this. Oh, I guess that's not. All right, so here we have the first completed square is there with the darks and then these lights. And then I have these yellow squares out here. Now I'm going to need to cut some 8.5-inch strips. So I'm going to use my mat here and simply cut 4 8.5-inch strips. Here are 2 of them. And as you can see, I am making use of my strip and square stash. I want to use everything. There we go. So we have dark, 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 light, and light. And you can completely reverse the value if you choose. Totally up to you. Such a simple block to make. So basically you're stitching this row in the beginning, then you're stitching these 2 outer rows, put that together into a unit. Then you're going to stitch this row. You're going to place these 2 on this unit, so that becomes your second row. And then this is your third row right here. So it's just a very, very simple block to make. Let me sew it together and I'll bring it back. We're going to square it up to 12.5 inches. So I have my Irish chain block finished. I've got a little issue right here. I got to take that apart and get that fixed. But anyway, it worked out beautifully. It's been squared up to 12.5 inches. I love using my scraps, and if you know me, you know I will use all kinds of scraps. I will use Christmas, holiday, prints, plains, you name it. I will put it in scrappy quilts. I think they just turn out beautiful when you do that, and it's a wonderful way to make use of everything that's in your stash. Now, this block can be made with basically strips all the way around here, because you can subcut your strips into 2.5-inch squares if you choose to. Of course, you do need a 4.5-inch center, although I suppose you can make a 4-patch there too if you choose to do that. So lots of different things you can do with that. Great ways to use up your scrap stash, and it'll really make a dent in your scrap stash if you try making these 2 blocks today, putting them together to make a beautiful quilt. And what a lovely lap-size quilt or even a queen-size quilt that you could create using these 2 blocks together. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you will try your hand, grab your scrap stash, and work with those 2 blocks. Simple blocks to make, and it will make a lovely quilt. And I would love to see pictures of the blocks and the quilts that you do make. I will link below in the description box my Facebook group page. It's Quilting with Lori, and it's Scrap Up Your Stash. So I will link that for you, and please go ahead and put some pictures out there of the things that you are working on. Everybody loves to see that. It's very inspiring. So thank you. I hope you enjoy the content that I provide. If you do, please don't forget to like and leave a comment and subscribe if you haven't already done so. If you're interested in becoming a member of my YouTube channel, I have some information below. You can watch a quick little video that gives more information about it. If you'd like to join us maybe for monthly Zoom calls, that would be a lot of fun. So until next time, happy quilting and have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.